April, and I'm here to tell you about my new Macs for Live devices. They are a pair of devices, and together they are a compander. So the idea is you have one device, Compander A, that compresses or expands the signal, and a second device, Compander B, which compresses or expands in exactly the opposite way. So between the two, they cancel out and restore the original signal. And in between them, you can put some kind of nonlinear effect, like a distortion. And this lets you control dynamic response and harmonic content with a lot more finesse. All the implementations I've been able to find of companders in Macs for Live or VSTs are single devices. So the companding happens in one device, and whatever happens in the middle of that process is predetermined. Maybe you can swap out a few different distortion flavors or something like that. I wanted to implement it as two Macs for Live devices so that you, as the user, can put whatever you want in between. So you have total flexibility. It can be any distortion plugin you want, maybe some other kind of compression, or something weirder. We will get into a lot of examples. So first I'm going to run through how these work, how to set them up, and then we'll talk about examples, use cases, and some weirder sound design stuff towards the end. So when you drop these in, Compander A and Compander B, they by default are not talking to each other. So you have to pair them together. And I think this is why I haven't found any other implementations of a compander like this in Macs for Live, because sending audio rate information between two devices is not straightforward. The solution that I landed on for these devices is using Ableton's built-in modulation system. And the way you connect them is by, on this first device, clicking pair, and then on the second device, clicking the knob. And now they are connected. And this is not perfect. It works really well if you're using gentle compression settings. If you're using fast settings, especially for responding to peak levels, high ratio, short times, stuff like that, you can get some artifacts. And sometimes that can actually be useful. We'll talk about some creative examples with that. But for general companding use cases, you probably want to keep the settings relatively gentle. You can push the threshold and ratio pretty hard, but the main thing to watch out for is the attack and release times and peak level. So now that these two things are connected, we have one device that's compressing or expanding the sound, and you can change which it's doing down here, and whatever you have selected, the second device is automatically going to do the opposite. So if I'm expanding over here, it's automatically compressing over here, and vice versa. The one other thing we have to do in terms of setup is latency compensation. So if I drop something in, like Ableton's saturator, we've run into a latency issue because the audio is going from Compander A to the saturator, which is delaying the signal by some amount, and then going to Compander B. But the control data is still going directly from A to B. And so the control data is not being delayed by that same amount. So by the time we hit Compander B, the control data and audio are going to be out of sync. So you can address that by selecting the audio effects that you have between A and B. And if you have multiple effects, you can select them all. And then hover your mouse over the title bar. And down here in this corner, Ableton will list how much latency those effects are introducing. In this case, it's 4 samples. So with that number, you come over to Compander B and click on this latency compensation box and just type that number in. And that's going to delay the control signal by the same amount. And now the control data and audio will be in sync. So that's how you set it up. You drop in Compander A and Compander B, pair them by clicking pair and then the knob over here, and then drop some effects in and type the latency amount over here. And now you're free to tweak compression and expansion settings. So I'll just quickly run through the rest of the controls here. In the middle, we have all the typical compressor stuff: threshold, ratio, attack and release, compression or expansion, and RMS or peak values. This is the first compressor I've ever designed, so it's a little inelegant. I would love to implement a soft knee, but I don't know how to do that. Maybe in the future. But for right now, it works really well, I think, as a compander pair. On the left, there's input and output gain. There's an info page with all that pairing information. There's a settings page, which right now has one setting. I'll probably add more with future updates. And on the right side, there's a scope. So you can see your input and output levels, threshold and gain reduction curves, and you can toggle those on and off individually. So let's get into the first example. This is sort of the classic Compander use case. I have here a weird synth thing. That's the lead line from a track I'm working on. There are two layers here. There's a sub, which is just a sub. And then we have all the lovely harmonic content. And they sound nice together, but they're a little imbalanced. That top end could use some crunch. If I just throw a distortion on here, it sounds nice. It adds a lot of timbre and harmonics, but we've lost all sense of dynamics. The sound no longer really swells in and out. It's sort of flat. So we can compensate for that with the Compander. So I have A and B on either side with some pretty aggressive but relatively long release time compression going on. And if we turn those on, now we have the best of both worlds. We've got control over harmonics and timbral content, but we also have control over dynamics. So we keep that dynamic shape. So it adds that grit but keeps the dynamics. And this is that classic use case that I really wanted to implement. Now let's talk about drums, because this thing can do really well on drums, and it can also do not so well on drums. Trying to respond to super fast material like this can introduce a lot of artifacts. So I have a couple examples. This first example is a drum break that I chopped up the other day. And this is an example where the Compander works really well. So if I try and just throw some aggressive distortion on this, it's way too much. The timbre is really nice, but it sort of wraps all those transients together. We almost lose all sense of individual drum hits, and it just becomes a wash of noise. If I toggle on these companders on either side, now we're getting all that punch, but also all that distortion. And again, this is dry and wet. So you can hear in this case, it works pretty well, but we are losing some of that transient information. In particular, I'll zoom in on the snare, and here's what it sounds like dry. Oh, we're getting a little transient there. Okay, here's what it sounds like dry. And with the Compander. We're keeping the general shape, but we're still losing some of that transient information. And I could probably clean this up with the transient shaper, but in this case, I think it sounds pretty good still with the entire drum break. The important note here is the release time. I have attack all the way down, and it's on peak mode, which means it's responding to these transients as fast as it possibly can. but we're still losing a little bit of that precision because of the imprecision inherently of Ableton's modulation. But it's pretty close. This release time is really what makes or breaks this whole setup. If I drop this any lower, you'll start to hear the sound really break up. And at a certain point, it just becomes nothing. So I have it at 14, which I think is the shortest possible to retain those drum hit sounds, just long enough to keep the tails intact while also still sculpting the sound. So I want to show another example where the Compander doesn't work so well. This is another drum loop that I made. It's pretty goofy. And we have the same problem, where if I try to just throw some distortion on here, I mean, that's ridiculous. We lose just all that dynamic information. And in this case, if I toggle on these companders, which have very similar settings to that other drum break, it helps a lot, but we are still losing a lot of transient information. In particular, if I zoom in on the snare here, here's that snare dry. And with the distortion and companding, we're still getting a sort of soft attack there. And in this case, it's savable. I'm just going to throw on a transient shaper from kilohertz and a little gain matching. And this totally brings our transients back. On the whole loop, it sounds like this. And this is not the transient shaper doing all the work. If I turn off the companders, so now we're just going straight from distortion to transient shaping, you can hear we're getting those transients, but we're losing all the tail dynamics. If I zoom in on the snare again, it's so flat on the end. With the compander, we get all that punch. So in this case, and in a lot of cases with drums, the compander takes care of the tails, and then you can throw some kind of transient shaping on the end to take care of the transients. There are definitely some cases with drums where the compander just doesn't work out. Sometimes, with certain combinations of input material and distortion types, the transients are just unretrievable. And I think this is basically a function of how imprecise the modulation system is between these two devices. I might try to address this in a future version of these devices, but I think it would involve totally reworking how they send information back and forth, and it would probably complicate the user experience, which I don't want to do. I really like how slick the setup is here, where you just click pair and click the knob. Any other setup would probably involve routing signals externally through audio tracks or something like that, which would be just a lot messier, and I don't think it would be worth the added precision. So we've talked a lot about compressing into a distortion and then expanding on the end. But what about the inverse, where you expand, distort, and then compress? So I have this little arpeggio loaded up in Wavetable. And I'm going to demonstrate this with another saturator, this time in waveshaping mode. And this type of distortion totally changes character and timbre depending on input level. So if I change this input level macro over time, you're going to hear the timbre totally change. So we get a whole range of interesting tonalities. And as the sound is entering that distortion, because it's pretty plucky, it's going to have a more extreme high-end response at the starts of the notes and then fade out. So you can hear we get a little movement in the distortion timbre on the decay of each note. But we can bring that out much more extremely if I turn on these companders, which are doing basically the same thing that we've been looking at, except they're expanding first and then compressing. We're now going to exaggerate that movement by a pretty extreme margin. Again, without and with. And this is letting us pull that nice vocal movement out of the distortion without sort of exaggerating the actual volume dynamics of the sound. Because if I turn this secondary device off, now we're just expanding into the distortion, getting that movement, but not recompressing it. I'm going to bring this output gain down a little bit. We get that timbre change, but now the volume envelope is totally choppy. If we bring this back up and turn the compression back on, we retain that nice balance of pluckiness and decaying tails with a much more exaggerated vocal movement out of the distortion. And this is the second thing that I really wanted to implement in the Compander setup. And it's why I thought in the first place to add an option where it expands and then compresses, specifically to pull this kind of vocal shifting timbre out of wavefolders and waveshapers. So now let's get into a few examples with some more creative approaches. I have pretty much the same arpeggio going on here. Slightly different timbre. And let's say I want to throw an OTT on here. And as we all know and love, that OTT is bringing out so much of the crispness of the high end and really polishing the sound to an extreme level. But it's also totally flattening our sound out. We've lost all those dynamics. So we can do the same sort of thing that we would do before with the distortion, where we compress and then expand. And now we get this lovely, crisp OTT sound, but we also retain the note shapes over time, and the decaying tails of these notes almost turn into sort of a reverb wash under everything else. But interestingly, they also get brought back up along with the note heads, because as the start of a note is raising up, we're bringing up the level of the entire signal, not just that individual note. So we almost get an interesting pumping effect out of this. So we get this lovely multi-band compressed sort of fluttering texture, and it's a lot more interesting timbrally than the dry sound, which is really pretty dull. So there are a lot of creative possibilities with putting different effects in between the two Compander devices, and lots of things I'm sure that I have yet to find. I've thought about, what would happen if you threw a reverb in there, formant shifting. There are a lot of interesting options. Okay, so I've saved my favorite example for last. This is a really interesting wave shaping setup. First, I'll show you what I've got going on heading into the effects chain. This is a simple wave shape and wavetable that's sort of a blend between a triangle and a saw wave. And I'm going to play this one live. I have an MPE controller, so I'm just going to bend some notes around. And I'm going to throw a saturator on here. Again, doing a sort of sinusoidal distortion. And this already sounds really interesting. We get a lot of interesting harmonics coming out of that. But I'm also going to throw on these companders, as is the topic of the day. And these are doing the same sort of expansion into a distortion thing that we looked at from before, but this time it's super tight. So we are dropping the threshold almost all the way down, ratio almost all the way up. And we're on peak mode, and the attack and release times are at almost 0. So this is going to follow the incoming waveform almost exactly. So as the wave peaks and troughs, those extreme amplitude values are going to get pushed into the distortion even harder. And then the outcoming signal is going to get modulated in the opposite direction. And this has a really interesting wave shaping effect on the signal. And again, all I'm doing is bending some notes around on a really simple waveform. And just through this relatively simple effects chain, we're getting some really interesting timbres. If we go really low, we can totally get into fart territory. That's just gross. And going the other way is interesting too. If we go to the total top end of the range, whoa, that's even a little too high. We start getting that digital aliasing as we hit the Nyquist frequency. I'm going to throw a couple OTTs on this. This is something I really like to do when I'm just trying to blast off. I like to just throw like 3 OTTs on it, or 4. Why not? Probably going to have to raise the output level. And that's just crazy. can get such interesting textures out of this, and also beautiful, like, two-note harmony things. As the notes bend in and out of harmonic relationships with each other. As they're dead center, we're getting these harmonies. But then as they bend that top note out, they start to phase against each other, and we're exaggerating that phasing with this effects chain, and now we get something really weird. So there are a lot of interesting and strange wave shaping opportunities. So that's about it. These are my Macs for Loud devices. I hope you'll check them out. They are available for free. There's going to be a link in the description. So please go give them a look. Let me know what you think. And I would love to hear any other interesting applications people come up with for these, because this is not a tool that's widely available. And this is by no means a perfect or flawless implementation of it, but I think it's really cool to have, and I'm glad to be able to distribute it for free. In the bottom corner here, there's an info tab that has the pairing instructions and also my email address. So if you find any bugs, unexpected behavior, if you have requests for features, feedback about the user experience, confusion about, how the controls are laid out, anything like that, I would love to hear about it. Let me know, and please enjoy.